Well, at least from my personal experience, listening to guys like Jordan Peterson or listening to yourself or listening to anybody talk about really deep, important subjects, even if you know what they're saying to be true, it reinforces it in your own mind and maybe even opens up new doors of comprehension. Jordan certainly did that with me. He was hitting some notes about human psychology and the reason why we behave in certain ways and the pitfalls of these certain types of behavior that I absolutely knew he was right. And maybe I'd even thought about them before, but seeing them reinforced so eloquently and seeing it expressed so articulately, it really it sparked life in my mind.
So I would agree with basically what Rogan said there and echo that. There's something about Jordan Peterson and the way that he can articulate truths that even if it's something I maybe agreed with before, he has a way of articulating in that it gives me a certainty. Like, yes, this must really be true. And then what does that mean for my life? Or even opening up new doors of comprehension. Why does that even matter? I'm just going to throw up a quote from the ancient philosopher right here, Socrates. An unexamined life is not worth living. And I would make the argument that a lot of us in 21st century America are kind of floating by and not examining life. So let's just make that the goal of this evening, to examine it, especially on an individual level. So really briefly, I'm assuming everybody here knows something about Jordan Peterson, otherwise you wouldn't be to talk about him tonight. But so we're on the same page. So he grew up in northern Alberta. He's a clinical psychologist, and he really follows the metrics, which in his words, that's one of the things that enables him to avoid being biased, to avoid pushing agenda. Because he'll say, all right, this is the data when he's meeting with a client. This is what's going to help you out. This is what's been successful in the past. Let's do this. A philosopher as well. If you've watched any of his videos, you've definitely heard him talk about Carl Jung and mythology, archetypes, things like that. He taught at Harvard, I think, for 6 years, and more recently at the University of Toronto, which a couple years ago, that was where he really came under scrutiny and kind of came into the limelight as far as internet fame due to fighting some new legislation in Canada about compelled speech. And really for me, it was learning more about him and his achievements, especially as a grad student, that were so impressive. If you look at all the different papers that he published and the research that he did, the guy in second place, there was this huge gap. Like, how could he achieve this much? And he's got all kinds of videos and lectures that are about developing you as a person. When I say you, I mean, of course, his college students that he works with and whoever happens to be watching his lectures. But to me, that's one of the things that was most impressive about him. He, in my opinion, this is a university professor the way that they should be. Someone who wants for you to develop as an adult, as a human being, not just learn information and take it on a test and get your certificate. So on his YouTube page, which has well over 1 million subscribers, he has a series of lectures on the Old Testament, biblical lectures. And just to give a little bit of background of his approach to it, I just want to share a clip. This is from his very first one.
But all of that makes up the background. So you have to think that we've extracted this story, this strange collection of stories with all its errors and its repetitions and its peculiarities out of the entire history that we've been able to collect ideas. And it's the best we've been able to do. And I know there are other religious traditions. I'm not concerned about that at the moment because we can use this as an example, but it's the best we've been able to do. And what I'm hoping is that we can return to the stories in some sense with an open mind and see if there's something there that we actually need, and I hope that that will be the case. And as I said, I'll approach it as rationally as I possibly can. So
I really respect that approach. Just saying, look, I'm not asking you to follow something blindly. I want to approach these stories as rationally as I can. And even though it's very common today to just do aside, kind of pull the rug out from our ancestors and their moral traditions especially, he's saying maybe there's something there that we missed. This book has guided cultures for centuries, for thousands of years, in fact. And as to a reason of why he approaches things the way he does, this is from the same lecture, another clip that happened a few minutes later.
And to stand up properly. And you need the tools to do that. And so I don't want to do anything in this lecture series that isn't practical. You know, I want you to come away having things put together in a way that you can immediately apply, not interested in abstraction for the sake of abstraction.
So I like that last line. It's not just thinking for the sake of some mental exercise, but really, how does this apply to your life? How can these principles be put to use right away to make an improvement for us on the individual level? And it seems that Jordan Peterson genuinely wants you to have the best life that you can have, a better life today than what you had yesterday. And it seems to me that this means behaving in a way as if God exists, ordering your life as if God is a reality. And that means a host of things. For one thing, there's good and evil, there's right and wrong. So sin, this is a term, especially outside of religious circles, we never hear this, right? Here, as many of you probably recognize, he was with Russell Brand having an interview, and they discuss in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, they discuss the word sin and where that comes from.
Become a channel of some inherent goodness.
Well, the thing that's one of the things that's interesting about that, well, two things actually. The first is the word sin means to miss the target. It's an archery term. So that's a very interesting way of thinking about it, because it means that
there is a target.
There is a target. That's the thing. But the next thing is, and this comes right out of that, is it's very useful to become aware of your faults, because as soon as you posit a fault, you posit the opposite. By merely saying, well, that's a fault, you're saying implicitly, well, there's something that's the opposite of that. So out of your recognition of faults, immediately some clarity of virtue develops. Because you might say, well, this is a fault and I really know it. It's like, great, you've got some bedrock there. Whatever the opposite of that fault is, you might not know what that is, but whatever the opposite of that fault is a virtue. And then you might say, well, I have 20 faults. It's like, great. The opposite of the personality that has all those 20 faults is the virtuous you, whatever that might happen to be. Well, great. Then you've conjured out of the devil a redeemer. It's something like that.
It was the philosopher Augustine that said, "It is better to be lost in passion than to have lost passion." And I think what he was getting at there, what he was hinting at, is the greatest sinners and the greatest saints of history have a lot in common, actually. They're both passionately pursuing happiness, right? It's the saints that are aware of that target, and they're evaluating where their arrow goes, right? The sin, right? The nature of that, how close they're getting, and they're ordering their life in a way of true happiness, essentially. They're aware of this definition of sin. And the saints are simply the ones that are living life intentionally. I guess that's how I'll end that thought. But both of them, both the saints and the sinners, they're passionate about life and what they think will lead them to happiness. And when we live as if this reality, if we live as if God isn't real, then that goes down a dark road. And the argument is made here in the next video. So I can name off the name of a popular philosopher, and you can probably give their more common quote, right? Like René Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." If I say Friedrich Nietzsche, you've probably heard him coin, "God is dead." So for me, a few months ago, I had never actually read any Nietzsche or heard of that quote in context. And it's kind of ironic here, but Jordan Peterson extrapolates on what he meant by that.
You know that Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced the death of God, right? And who was a great, great critic of Christianity, a vicious critic of institutional Christianity, in the best sense, you know. And he announced the death of God, and he said that we'd never find enough water to wash away the blood. It wasn't a triumphant proclamation, even though it's often read that way. And Nietzsche's conclusion from the death of God, the fact that our ethical systems were going to collapse when the foundation was pulled out from underneath them, he believed that human beings would have to find their own values, to create their own values. And there's a problem with that, because it doesn't seem, this is something Carl Jung was very thorough in investigating, it doesn't really look like people are capable of creating their own values, because you're not really capable of molding yourself just any old way you want to be. Like, you have a nature that you have to contend with. And so it isn't a matter of creating our own values, because we don't have that capacity. It might be a matter of rediscovering those values, which is what Jung was attempting to do. Now, and so I think Nietzsche was actually profoundly wrong in that recommendation. I think he was psychologically wrong. Now, you know, Dostoevsky wrote in many ways in parallel to Nietzsche, and was a great influence on Nietzsche. Their lives parallel each other to a degree that's somewhat miraculous. In some sense, it's quite uncanny. Dostoevsky was obviously a literary figure, whereas Nietzsche was a philosopher, a literary philosopher, but still a philosopher. And Dostoevsky wrestled with exactly the same problems that Nietzsche wrestled with. But he did it in a different way. He did it in a literary manner. And he has this great book, The Brothers Karamazov, and in that book, the hero of the book is really Alyosha, who's a monastic novitiate, a very good guy, kind of not an intellect, but a person of great character, but he has a brother, Ivan, who's his older brother, who's a great intellect and a very handsome soldier and a brave man. And like Dostoevsky's villains, Ivan isn't exactly a villain, but that's close enough. Dostoevsky makes his villains extraordinarily powerful. So if Dostoevsky's trying to work out an argument, he clothes the argument in the flesh of one of his characters. And if it's an argument he doesn't agree with, then he makes that character as strong as he possibly can, as strong and as attractive and intelligent as he possibly can, and then he lets him just have at her. And so Ivan is constantly attacking Alyosha, and from every direction trying to knock him off his perch of faith, let's say. And Alyosha can't address a single one of Ivan's criticisms. And he doesn't have the intellect for it, and Ivan has a devastating intellect. It's devastating to himself as well. But what happens in the Brothers Karamazov essentially is that Alyosha continues to act out his commitment to the good, let's say, and in that manner he's triumphant. It doesn't matter that he loses the arguments, because the arguments aren't exactly the point. The arguments in some sense are a side issue, because the issue is, and this is the existential issue, the issue is not what you believe as if it's a set of facts, but how you conduct yourself in the world. And so Dostoevsky, he grasped that, and it's one of the things that makes him such an amazing literary figure, an amazing genius, because he was smart enough to formulate the arguments in a manner that no one else really could, with the possible exception of Nietzsche, and that's quite an exception. And yet he could still, using his dramatic embodiment, he could still lay out solutions to the problems that he was describing that are extremely compelling. And both Crime and Punishment, which is an amazing, thrilling, engrossing book, and the Brothers Karamazov, all of Dostoevsky's great books really circulate around those profound moral issues. And so I've learned a tremendous amount from reading him.
So with Nietzsche's quote, it's ironic. He didn't just say God is dead. He followed that up with, and we have killed him, and we will never be able to get enough water to wash the blood out of the streets. He was essentially, what's ironic is, as an atheist, he's saying, if on a wide scale we live out these atheist values, that I'm not held accountable to anyone, there's no such thing as judgment. If we wipe away all of our traditions, our moral traditions from our ancestors, we're in for horrible times. So many people will say that he actually predicted the atrocities of the 20th century, from Stalin's Russia and Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, things like that were built on this atheistic principle. And then going over to Dostoevsky, I think it was Einstein who said, I learned more from Dostoevsky than from any scientist, which is just profound. And those of you who have read any of his novels, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But the question shouldn't just be, what is true, but also, what is the best way to live? There was a video I watched not long ago, and forgive me, I can't remember who made it, so I'll just call him the YouTuber. And he posed this question: is Jordan Peterson stealing away Sam Harris's fans? And if you know anything about Sam Harris, you probably heard he's one of the so-called four horsemen of the new atheist, right? And this YouTuber, he gets into, I was atheist and an intellectual, and I feel like in the mainstream media, it's just not those types of atheists represented. So there's a kind of loneliness and not feeling a connection with anyone. And then I found out about Sam Harris. And this guy was brilliant, just very intellectual, witty, convincing. And furthermore, he addressed a component of life that I hadn't got before. So you talk to any healthcare professional about holistic health, and they'll say there's three components: psychological, physiological, and spiritual. And Sam Harris, as an atheist, addresses that physical component. He talks about meditation and things like that. So this YouTuber goes on to say, I was better than I had ever felt before in life, but there was still this ceiling that couldn't be that high. And it was the crushing realization of, if I take atheism to its logical conclusion, that means we're here by random chance. What I do doesn't matter. My life is meaningless. My actions, there's no purpose there. And he continues and says, and then I heard about Jordan Peterson. And this was a guy, an intellectual, someone that I could really connect with. And he was honest, and he approached the Bible by saying, yeah, there's some stories in there. It's really difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile different things within the Bible. But there's something there to learn from. All of these stories have an implication that if I carry out these values, my life will improve. And basically, the heart of the message that really affected this YouTuber that I'll call was, your actions matter. Your life has meaning. And that's one of the most attractive messages. So he ended the video saying, I'm not necessarily saying I'm a theist, but I'm open to that. But one way or another, I know from listening to his lectures, I know that my life has meaning. I know that I matter, that I have some value. And life has been much better now than it has been any time before this. And I think one of the reasons that message is so popular is because there's such a widespread nihilism. Like we see, and that's a lot of the comedy today too, right? We see all kinds of jokes and memes like this. Can you read that font? Yeah, so the guy says, if you only had a week to live, what would you do? And the woman answered, I'd travel a week into the future. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't find any humor in this, right? I can see how that's funny too. But at the same time, on a deeper level, I think there's a bit of despair. Like, do we really believe this though? If life is meaningless, then is it better that I'm here than to not be here? And I think, again, that's why Jordan Peterson's message is so popular at this point in history, because it's so needed. So the clip that I'll show here in just a minute is from, again, his biblical lecture series. At the end of all those lectures, he takes some time for Q&A. And a person read a quote from Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, and he said, this is just one sentence from Ratzinger, and I want you, Professor Peterson, to kind of expand on it, break it apart. Ratzinger answered the question, why does a person search for God?
Now, this young man told me that his life lacked purpose and direction and meaning, and that he was nihilistic until he read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book I actually like quite a bit. I've read it 3 times at different decades of my life. And one of the things that's very interesting about that book is that it's an examination of the idea of quality, of the idea that there are qualitative distinctions between things, and that we have an instinct to make qualitative distinctions. And so a qualitative distinction is simply, this is better than that, which is a judgment. Okay, now what Ratzinger is hypothesizing is that the person in and of, you know how the modern idea is you're supposed to accept yourself. I think that's an insane idea, by the way. Really, I can't think of a more nihilistic idea than that you're already okay. It's like, no, you're not. And the reason you're not is because you could be way more than you are. And so what do you want to be? You want to be okay as you are? Or do you want to strive towards what's better? And this young man, this Australian, he said that the reason that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance had such an impact on him was because he wasn't happy with his current mode of being, right? He didn't consider the manner in which he conducted himself sufficient. And the fact that the author of Zen, and it was Persig, laid out the notion that you could make qualitative distinctions, and there really was a difference between good things and bad things, or great things and evil things. It gives you direction. It gives you the possibility of moving upward. And Ratzinger is pointing out, at least to some degree, that human beings are insufficient in and of themselves and need the movement upward. And so they need to conceptualize something like the highest good, and then to strive for that. And the thing is that there isn't any difference between conceptualizing the good and being judged. Because if you're going to conceptualize the good and move towards it, what you have to do is separate from yourself all those things that aren't good and leave them behind. And that's why the Redeemer and the Judge are the same thing. And one of the things that's really appalling, I think, about our modern world is that we're rejecting the notion of qualitative distinctions. You say, well, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying that one thing is better than another. It's like, okay, fair enough. It's not fun to be cast off with the damned, that's for sure. But if people are, in fact, insufficient in their present condition, which seems to be the case, I mean, try finding someone who isn't, then if you deny the possibility of qualitative distinction because you want to promote a radical egalitarianism, then you remove the possibility of redemption. because there's no movement towards the good. And it seems to me that it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for, well, it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for the equal. Because for us to be equal would mean, as far as I can tell, that we would all be equally unredeemed and miserable. And so,
I think most of us, or all of us, have a desire to move ahead, right? To become better. And where do you start? That's actually something that Peterson in his lectures, he spent some time on too, which I'll build up to. I'm assuming most of you either heard this talk from Admiral McCraven or you at least saw the picture. It went viral. A few years ago, he gave this speech to the graduating class at the University of Texas. And he started out with this quote: "If you want to change the world, start off by making your bed." And he meant that in full sincerity. And he went on to say, you're starting your day with an achievement, right? And this is a hit of dopamine. And you kind of stand up a little taller and you think, okay, what's next? It's a way of attacking the day. In the Catholic tradition, there's a saint, Jose Maria Escriva. He actually made it even earlier in the chronological order. He said, no, if you just get out of bed when the alarm goes off, if you don't hit the snooze button, if you can beat that temptation. He elevated that so high, he said, this is called the heroic moment. Right when your alarm goes off, if you can actually get out of bed and move. He said that's how you attack the day. That's how you start being productive. The achievements snowball, right? So of course, Peterson, he doesn't just leave it at the getting up out of bed or making your bed, but clean your whole room. And gets into a little bit of the psychology of that.
And so to sort yourself out and to fix up your room is a non-trivial matter, you know. And you can do that. You'll learn by doing that, and then maybe you'll learn enough by doing that so that you can fix up your family a little bit, and then having done that, you'll have enough character so that when you try to operate in the world at your job or maybe in the broader social spheres, that you'll be a force for good instead of harm, because you'll have learned some humility by noting just how difficult it was to put your damn room together, well, and yourself for that matter. And so you'll proceed cautiously with your eyes open toward.
So essentially what I get from that, bring order into the what used to be chaos and little things, and make a habit of doing that, and they become bigger. So what he's hinting at here is oftentimes called the Matthew principle, if you've heard of that. So it's actually a parable from the New Testament, from the Gospel of Matthew. To him who has, more will be given. So there's a story told in Matthew that goes, there was a very rich man who went away for a time, and he left a lot of his money to 3 different people to steward it. To the first, he gave 5 talents, this measure of gold, which actually that translates really well for us in English. 5 talents of gold. To the second one, 2. To the third one, 1. Each according to his ability. And he's gone for a long amount of time, and he came back, and he's basically asking him, okay, what'd you do? And to the person who had 5 talents, he said, Master, look, I took these, I made 5 more. And the master says, well done, my good and faithful servant. Since you have been faithful, you've been trustful with little things, I will put you in charge of big things. And he says the same thing to the person who had 2 talents of gold, who made 2 more. And then the third person who had just 1 talent, he basically was scared. He squandered his gift. He dug a hole in the ground and buried it. And the master comes back and he says, you know, here's your 1 talent back. I didn't do anything with it. And he goes, you wicked, lazy servant. And the thought process there is, again, to him who has, more will be given. And then you think, well, if I don't have much, what if I'm only the person with the 1 talent? Do something with it, right? Start off with these little things like making your bed and making sure your room is clean, bringing order into that. And it carries into bringing order into your work and into your relationships and your family. It's basically a place to start. So getting back to Peterson and how he's a big fan of Carl Jung and these archetypes that go along with hero mythology. And what do I mean by hero mythology? Essentially, mythology, think of it like myths, legends, stories of heroes and why they stand the test of time. There's these stories that we've told for thousands and thousands of years. And he considers this hyper-true. It's not just true in the sense that you can take the scientific method and deconstruct it, but there's something about that calls us. There's something about these hero stories that makes us want to emulate this hero, something about their virtue. And the archetype, something that's deep within them. It's not just a stereotype, something really shallow, but part of who they are, like what it means to be masculine or feminine, what it means to be the warrior, right, the leader, or the ruler, the king or queen, the the person who can bring the most amount of good to this community. Those are different hero archetypes. And if you want to get more into depth with this, the very first time he was on Joe Rogan's podcast, you can YouTube Joe Rogan episode 877 or just Jordan Peterson and find it. The last 45 minutes, it's a 3-hour long podcast, but it's fantastic. The last 45 minutes, he gets into this specifically and essentially says the figure of Christ, one of the things that separates him from everyone else, Christ is an amalgamation of all these hero archetypes. Whereas if you look at the Avenger movies, you can pick out any one of those characters and they have all these virtues, but they also have their weaknesses too. And he says we just don't see that in the historical figure of Christ. But one of the examples that I want to point out is simply St. George and the Dragon. Excuse me. And we've heard this many different times. Probably some of your favorite movies and books and things like that. But in essence, the hero archetype of that is descend down into the darkness, into the unknown, and fight the dragon of chaos head on with everything you have. And if you survive, you'll have something of supreme value and escort that back into the light and share that with those around you, with the community. So with George, we actually see he's fighting a literal dragon in the story, right, in the myth or the legend. And then he frees the princess, and what he brings back isn't just the princess back to the people, to her kingdom, but he liberates the people from this fear and from the unknown. And when we see this, Jordan Peterson makes the case that J.K. Rowling, the reason that she's so rich and famous is because she tells these archetypal stories very well. So I think it's the second Harry Potter, The Chamber of Secrets. It's the same thing, but it's retold in a very good format. So Harry goes down under the castle and fights this dragon-like or serpent-like basilisk. And he comes out and he's essentially mortally wounded, but it's a phoenix, the tears of the phoenix, that heals him. And that symbolizes regeneration. It's like a death and rebirth. So he comes out a new man, and then he rescues Virginia, and he liberates the whole community, all these students, from being petrified from fear of the unknown, of this basilisk. And we see this, again, in a lot of your favorite movies and books and things like that. A story from the New Testament when Christ goes into the desert. And the desert is always synonymous with occupied territory. Right? It's land of the enemy. It's the unknown. He goes into the desert and he's tempted for 40 days. And the number 40 is highly symbolic too. It basically means a period of testing. And it also means long enough. So was Christ the historical figure? Was he literally in the desert for 40 days? Maybe. But how long was he there for? Long enough. Long enough to be tested and to come out victorious. And he's tested against his arch nemesis, Satan. And he comes out and then he goes on mission. And he spreads this truth, this value he has of beating evil with the masses. And he heals and he teaches. And one part of that I want to point out, though, that's a little bit different is before he ever goes into the desert, the event that takes place right before that, he hears everybody around him, they hear this voice from heaven, right? The Father figure, God the Father saying, "Behold, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." I have yet to meet a person who doesn't have a father wound of some type. I don't know what it is about this, but from our dads or our father figure, there's some area where they missed the mark. They weren't perfect, and we carry that with us. And here, Christ, from Father, is hearing two things. I love you, and you're good enough. You have what it takes, and that's the motivation. And he descends into this desert, into the unknown, and he's able to fight evil and prevail and come out and share what he's acquired with the people. And we're getting pretty close to closing now. I want to share, there's one more story from his biblical lectures. This is on Abraham, and basically paying attention to what beckons you forward.
And the Lord said unto Abram, and this is the opening of the story, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." And this is one of those phrases where every clause is significant. Go somewhere you don't understand. And from thy kindred. Well, what does that mean? It means grow up, right? That's what it means. It means get away from your family enough so that you can establish your independence. And that isn't because there's something wrong with your family, although perhaps there is, as there is perhaps wrong with you. But it means get away. I talk to people very frequently whose families have provided them with too much protection. And they know it themselves. And that means they're deprived of necessity. you know, one of the things that you see in the United States, for example, is that the children of first-generation immigrants often do better than their children. And the reason for that is that the children of first-generation immigrants have necessity driving them. And you don't know how much you need necessity to drive you, because maybe you're not very disciplined. And if a catastrophe doesn't immediately befall you if you don't act forthrightly today, then maybe you never act forthrightly, right? Because the gap between your foolishness and the punishment is lengthened by your unearned wealth, and so you never grow up and learn, and you have to get yourself away from your dependency in order to allow necessity to drive you forward. And that's to become independent and to become mature. And so the idea that what moves you away from your country and your father's house and the comforts of your childhood home is something that's beyond you and that you listen to and hearken to. That's exactly right. And you can say, well, I don't want to call that God. It's like, it doesn't matter what you call it exactly. It doesn't matter to what it is, what it's called. It still is. And if you don't listen to it, that's the other thing. If you don't listen to it, and I've been a clinician and talked to enough people now, as old as I am, to know this absolutely. If you do not listen to that thing that beckons you forward, you will pay for it like you cannot possibly imagine. You'll have everything that's terrible about life in your life and nothing about it that's good. And worse, you'll know that it was your fault and that you squandered what you could have had.
The writer of the majority of the books in the New Testament, in the scripture, Christian scriptures, St. Paul, he talks a lot about this obeying your conscience, this voice that beckons you forth. So, from an Old Testament prophet, Isaiah, your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. It sounds like from behind us, right, pushing us forward. If you're like me, you can definitely think of times in your life where you heard this. There was some situation, some opportunity that presented itself, and everything within you was saying, yes, take it, go. This is the way, walk in it. And if you resulted with inaction, then you definitely regretted it later. Right? I felt that. I knew that, and I said no. Whoever knows what is right to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. If you know, and you usually do from this voice beckoning you forth, if you know that and you fail to do it, for you, that was missing the mark. The target, right? And you know you missed. And on that happy note, probably the most popular of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous is the first one. Admitting it is the first step. At least pay attention to where it lands on the target, right? To how close you are, evaluate to move forward from there. So let's all just basically take that to heart and examine our lives on the individual level, see how close we are to the target, and reorder our lives in a way that hits it.